Thank you all so much for joining today's webinar on supply chain realignment, exploring and understanding and leveraging the India opportunity. We are more than a year now into a worldwide pandemic, and as a result, global corporations have had to find new ways of conducting business for survival and hopefully for growth. Rising protectionist policies, tax and regulatory scrutiny, and restrictions on foreign investments are directly exposing some supply chain related vulnerabilities. So from diversification to reshoring to regionalization, we see that companies are really evaluating multiple options to drive their supply chain resilience. And this evolving landscape has created unprecedented opportunities for Asian economies to become preferred alternate locations. So India, much like other emerging economies in the region, is exploring ways to build its investment attractiveness to make it a viable contender for global manufacturing and sourcing. During this session today, we'll begin with an overview of the supply chain realignment opportunity presented by senior partners from KPMG in India. And then following that, I will be joined by Neeraj Bansal, Naveen Aggarwal, and Himanshu Tewari from KPMG India in an interactive fireside chat. And we'll be discussing how to decode the global supply chain realignment landscape and some of the key considerations that global leaders should have in mind as they look to better understand and leverage the opportunities in India. So now I would like to just briefly introduce our speakers for today. First, we have Neeraj Bansal. And Neeraj is the partner and chief operating officer, India Global at KPMG in India. He's also the partner in charge of the supply chain realignment program for the Indian firm. Neeraj has significant experience in supply chain and has led multiple client engagements in things like centralization of supply chains, process reviews, creating procurement and contracting manuals, and supporting clients' implementation of supply chain ERP modules. He's also conducted value chain analysis for multinational corporations operating in multiple sectors. Neeraj has actively participated in sectoral committees and initiatives of major industry bodies and central and state government organizations in India. In addition, he's authored several articles and points of view and participated in various national and international forums on supply chain realignment opportunities in South Asia and India. Also joining us today, we have Naveen Aggarwal. Naveen is a partner and North India tax head with KPMG in India. With more than 27 years of work experience, Naveen has advised several large global multinationals across sectors, including technology, telecom, media, e-commerce, and consumer markets, on corporate and international tax matters, including a myriad of things such as market entry, inbound and outbound investment structuring, funding, cash repatriation strategies, incentive planning, value chain management, and much more. Naveen is a member of leading US-India industry chambers, where he is a nominated chair on various subcommittees. Naveen is also an active speaker at various national and international industry and tax conferences. And then we also have Himanshu Tewari, and he's a partner focusing on trade and customs specialization as part of the tax practice at KPMG India. With more than 25 years of work experience, Himanshu has advised several large global multinationals across sectors on global trade-related operating model, global value chain cost efficiency and compliance, and looked at tariff and non-tariff barriers, customs valuation, and harmonizing with transfer pricing. He's also worked on things related to value chain management, trade and customs policy advocacy, and regulatory and dispute resolution matters. Himanshu is a member of the CII West Zone Committee on International Trade and Investment, and is an active speaker at various national and international industry and trade conferences. So with that, I look forward to hearing from our speakers today as they really help explain and put some detail and information around what the global supply chain realignment opportunity is. Now I will turn it over to Neeraj and Naveen.
Thank you so much, Marisa, for your kind words and for a wonderful support that you got in organizing this session on a very timely topic. This is an area where we continue to witness significant interest and questions from the industry players. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. What a pleasure to be here with you today. And for the next 1 hour, together with my friends and colleague partners, Naveen and Himanshu from KPMG in India, we will discuss with you the global supply chain opportunity. In the current section, I will start with a quick context on the global supply chain opportunities and considerations. And then I'll move on to some of the India advantages. And my colleague Naveen will shed light on taxation, special incentives, and sectoral opportunities. These are all important aspects to consider, especially for companies when they're looking at the decision journey for relocation or a capacity addition. So let's begin. As you can see on the slide, that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, the global economy was in the middle of major geopolitical disturbances. These are the ones that affected the global supply chains across industries. Companies around the world were already facing enormous pressure to realign and rethink where and how the products are produced, raw materials are sourced, and how dynamically changing customer demands are fulfilled. While supply chain reconfiguration has been happening around the world all the time, the turbulence in global trade and the pandemic that has followed has brought the issue of reshuffling supply chains back into focus, with Asia at its epicenter. Over the last couple of years, we all have been witnessing that companies have been adopting a China plus one strategy to diversify supply chain risks while also tapping into China's advantages in manufacturing. And when companies have tried to do that, naturally, the companies have been scouting for alternative suppliers in emerging markets which have similar business environment as China, as they are the likely candidates for shifting the supply chain, whether partial or whether in a major aspect of it. Also, when companies are looking at this change to happen, they have to consider several factors, including the ease of doing business, labor cost, scale of labor force, where a few Asian economies, including India, Thailand, and Vietnam, have been best positioned to attract foreign companies and investors. And as you can see from the bar graph on the screen, which is demonstrating that while FDI in China has grown by 6% in 2020, the inflows in South Asia have increased by a whopping 20% to $71 billion. Next slide, please, Madison. Companies that have been diversifying their manufacturing operations or thinking about manufacturing operations to get diversified, they have been seeing that, to ensure that they don't put everything in one area or one geography, putting every egg in or all eggs in one basket. They have four possible options or trajectories that come for them. They're looking at either reshoring, diversification of the supply chain, regionalization, and replication. Many firms from various countries, including the US, Japan, and South Korea, have been now in various stages of this journey. Some have already begun this journey and are midway or have already partially done the completion also for some of the aspects of it there. And somewhere the electronics industry has been the first to kind of adopt that. And then there are many in the pipeline which are currently exploring how to diversify or shift their production facilities to developing markets. Now, countries in Asia are wanting to capitalize on this trend, and they have tried to see that they've got various initiatives running to make it easy for the companies to relocate, reinvent their supply chains. While India, on one hand, is focusing on building a stronger manufacturing ecosystem, and they have launched production-linked incentive scheme, popularly we're calling it as PLI. Japan has announced a $221 million US a China exit subsidy for Japanese companies looking for reshoring or as well as relocating to some of the countries in the region. Now we'll focus on some of the aspects around the India opportunity areas, how India is positioning itself in this area from various perspectives. Next slide, please, Madison. So the Indian government has introduced several significant reforms in the past couple of years, and they have realized that this is a great time to attract companies for whom supply chain has become a top priority. And we'll discuss these in slightly more detail now. Next slide, please, Madison. As part of COVID-19 relief package, the Indian central government had laid out its clear intent to facilitate commercialization of businesses. Some of them were earlier restricted to public sector or state-owned enterprises, as referred to. Some of these have already happened as well. So as you can see on the slide, defense, railways, space exploration, coal mines, and power distribution. Here, there is a relaxation has happened in India. FDI limit, for example, in defense sector has now been increased from 49% to 74%. The government has also opened the Indian Space Research Organization, or ISRO, their facilities to the private sector. And secondly, working behind the scenes and playing a crucial role in success of all these sectors has been the country's infrastructure. The country plans to spend almost $1.7 trillion from 2020 to 2025 on the infrastructure projects, including dedicated freight corridors and also improve last mile connectivity. All of this is likely to reduce goods transportation time, which currently takes days to hours. And as you can see from the slide, there are results are fair for all of us to see. In 2020, while the global FDI flows decreased by 35% to $1 trillion from $1.5 trillion in 2019, India's FDI, on the other hand, has actually increased by 27% to $64 billion, a significant increase in the year of pandemic. Also, in terms of the overall perspective, look at it, why this FDI has increased is also the fact that there have been a surge in actual and planned investments in the information communication technology space, healthcare, and infrastructure, and which is all helping to grow this FDI flow to India. And it's also increasing in select sectors as well. And we'll just discuss on some of the other parameters as well. Next slide, please, Madison. As you can see on this slide, there are many cost factors which are helping as well in this particular area. So in addition to creating a conducive environment to encourage domestic manufacturing, India's competitive cost arbitrage is also driven by the country's favorable labor costs and the size of labor pool as well there. It is all helping us to enforce that India, position India as a more of a global manufacturing hub for select sectors. And the government's policy thrust has also been supportive of an investment-driven growth model, with the recent cut in corporate taxes, which were as high as 30% to 22% for existing companies. And the government came up with a new provision as well for new manufacturing firms, where the tax rate has been slashed from 25% to 15%. This measure has brought the corporate tax for India broadly at par with the average tax rate of 23% for Asian countries. Let me now request Naveen to discuss the taxation landscape and also touch upon some of the sectoral opportunities. Over to you, Naveen.
Okay. Thank you, Neeraj. And good morning, good evening to all of you. As we look at tax, tax certainly is one of an important consideration as companies are looking at reorienting their supply chain. And given how the tax world is changing, and we've seen a lot of changes happening in the recent past. In fact, over the last few weeks, there have been tremendous activity where the OECD and basically the OECD and G20 countries effectively are trying to reach some sort of an agreement on what should be the minimum tax rate across the world. There are some new norms which are being prescribed where you don't need to have a physical presence in another country, but even if you are operating remotely, because of the nexus being created, because in view of a market located in another country, you could be subject to tax. So these are evolving times in the global tax arena. And therefore, it's important to do important scenario and risk planning as you're looking at your entire supply chain around various parameters, whether it is in terms of ease of setup, in terms of tax rates, trade and customs, tax incentives, and other important supply chain related considerations. Now, if you look at India's tax structure, historically, it's been extremely complex. We've had very high tax rates. It's been a difficult country to operate in because of the sheer amount of tax litigation that we have, and therefore making it difficult in terms of operability for foreign investors. But that has undergone a significant shift, and the focus of the government, especially over the last few years, has really been to drive increased competitiveness, bring about some more certainty and predictability in the tax rates, driving ease of compliance, essentially to address the concerns of the investors, create some stability, and enhance public trust. All of this has also been done with an added focus on increased deployment of technology. So what are some of the trends that are playing out? First, as Neeraj mentioned, the focus has been to make the tax rate more competitive, bring down the headline tax rate from 30% to 20%, early 20s, and for manufacturing companies, bring it down further to 15%. Also remove what was considered to be a big challenge by companies in terms of a dividend distribution tax that had to be paid on distribution of profits out of India. That has been abolished. And therefore, the tax regime in India has become more benign to that extent. And that really puts India in a competitive position when you look at the OECD and other Asian countries. If you look at certainty, that's again something that investors want. They want predictability in tax rates, predictability in how the law is applied, interpretation of the law. So that's something that the government has been increasingly focused on. They've come out with mechanisms for taxpayers to know upfront certainty around the pricing of transactions, because in a supply chain kind of scenario, assuming it's a related party transaction, pricing becomes an important consideration. So you have forums like the Authority for Advanced Ruling, which is now being termed as a Board for Advanced Ruling, to get certainty on the taxability of a transaction. Or for that matter, you have mechanisms like advanced pricing agreement. There is a conscious effort also by the government to reduce the number of disputes that are there, which are stuck in the courts. Overall, the focus has been on increasing compliance, and we've seen India being fairly resilient amongst all the South Asian countries in 2020, and 2021 also looks extremely promising. The foreign direct investment norms have been relaxed. Neeraj touched upon it. There's FDI, which has been 100% FDI involved, allowed in contract manufacturing under the automatic route. Apart from defense, there are also certain relaxations that have been introduced on the sourcing norms for single brand retail trading, as well as investment in overseas digital media. So we're seeing a lot of relaxations coming on some of the sectors which were historically considered to be sensitive sectors in India. Funding becomes an important consideration, and companies are looking at raising funds from overseas. There were certain restrictions on the end use of those funds. Those have got relaxed. There were challenges around dealing with stressed assets in India. There was a huge, lengthy process involved in winding down a company and sale of the stressed assets, which now has been addressed through a mechanism or through a regulation which is called as Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and that's been very effective in streamlining all of these processes. The compliance obligations for foreign companies that are operating that don't even have a presence in India but are earning from India has also been relaxed. All in all, there's greater focus on stability and trust. Also, India wants to continue to be attractive as an export destination, as an export country, in order to maintain its growth trajectory. And therefore, we're seeing some new changes being introduced on the foreign trade policy. India is also looking at entering into bilateral FTAs, and some sort of quick trade deals with select countries, and we'll talk about that. If you look at technology has played an important role and has been embraced in the entire tax system. Government has launched an income tax portal, which again helps in easing compliance for taxpayers. The goods and service tax also helps has also used a lot of technology. This is an integrated tax that we have subsuming close to 17 indirect taxes brought in the statute a few years back, and now it's kind of stabilizing. Move to the next slide, please. So as Neeraj mentioned that there are a whole lot of sector opportunities that are being opened up to encourage domestic manufacturing. Some 20 plus sectors have been identified by the government, and these include sectors like electronics, automobiles, telecom, pharma, and India wants to really increase its share in the global trade and value chain. And this includes both fiscal and non-fiscal benefits that are being provided in these sectors. In 2020, in November, the government, with a lot of fanfare, introduced the PLI scheme, the Production Linked Incentive Schemes. That has been launched for 10 sectors. And the whole purpose of the PLI scheme is really to build domestic capabilities in select product areas and boost domestic manufacturing, move up the value chain, and therefore de-risk the overall supply chain. This has been this scheme. We'll talk a little bit about later on this, but basically gives incentives to companies on the incremental value of sales, and there are certain percentage prescribed depending on which sector this relates to. All in all, we are seeing that the focus really is creating certain clusters, whether it's the electronic equipment clusters, the medical clusters, or even for that matter, providing state-based incentives. Because difference now, because of this whole concept of, in one instance, GST is an example of cooperative federalism, but also states are competing against each other, vying for increased investment from foreign investors, and therefore they are coming out with their own customized incentive package. We move to the next slide, please. So the future outlook, if you look at it, is clearly manufacturing. The government wants to be more self-reliant, and they want to increase domestic manufacturing. They want to move beyond the traditional sectors. They want to get into emerging areas like 3D printing, electric vehicles, solar panels, food processing. These are some of the sectors that are gaining a lot of traction. India wants to be a global export hub, and therefore there is some amount of interlinkages that we're seeing between the foreign trade policy, as well as the FDI and the industrial policies. All of this with the view to encourage high value-added technology-intensive products being exported from India. Neeraj talked about logistics and infrastructure. This is an important thrust area to improve the overall infrastructure ecosystem. And then if you just move to the next slide, please. So what are the key considerations? As you can see here, that and some of which we've talked about. Of course, it's important to look at market size, and here you should important to understand that India is not one single market. It's a number of markets, because each the regional markets are markets by themselves, and therefore one needs to look at understanding the nuances of the market, what the potential is, what are the sectors that are thriving in, say, the northern part of the country may be different from what are there in the southern part of the country. Also the government is trying to move up its the whole process of ease of doing business in India, ease of setting up business in India. So some work has been done, and there's more to be done in the months and years ahead. Logistics and infrastructure we spoke about. Tax and regulatory continues to be an area that the government is continuously focusing on, introducing various incentives, and importantly, enforcement of contracts. I think this is something that continues to be a challenge. There are particular challenges in terms of enforcing contracts in India, and it really depends on how you're currently operating in India, because companies may be operating through their wholly owned subsidiary, they may be operating through a joint venture, they may be operating through franchisee arrangements. So it really depends on how the whole arrangement is structured. And of course, ease of exit also becomes an important consideration. So with that, we'll just wrap up the presentation and then move to the next part of the session.
Thank you both, Neeraj and Naveen. And we're now going to start our interactive fireside chat, if you will. And I'm Marisa Brown from APQC, and I invite Neeraj, Naveen, as well as Himanshu to join me as we have some conversation about some of the information that was just shared and delve into what this opportunity really looks like. So let's start with the realignment trend, if you will. And the dynamics of global trade and this pandemic that we've been dealing with have really disrupted established supply chains. And manufacturers are under some severe pressure to find ways, in many cases, to reduce their dependency on a particular country or region. So Neeraj, let's start with you on this question. Do you see a visible trend in relocation across the Asia Pacific region? And do you expect a massive relocation drive in the immediate to near term?
Thank you, Marisa. And as we discussed in the earlier section, supply chain diversification has been an issue of interest for some time. And many of the changes that we're seeing today have actually started some time back. So companies are becoming more and more focused on the weaknesses in their supply chain. The ensuing global trade dynamic and also the COVID-induced changes are now putting this focus on how demand patterns are changing, and also how customer behavior is changing as well, with that. So with all of this happening, one thing certainly is happening, that companies are getting more and more motivated to secure low-cost suppliers and focus their efforts on maintaining their financial health in the short to medium term, irrespective of whether they plan to relocate and where they want to relocate as well. And in this journey, they are considering the rewards and risk of shifting or diversifying supply chain operations within their own country or beyond into other regions as well there. And some of the factors are actually influencing this. So if you were to look at some of the product categories which are getting exposed to new tariffs or specific protectionist policies, because as the pandemic spread out and the supply chain got disrupted, we witnessed that many countries have on selective basis imposed tariff restrictions. And because of the geopolitical tension as well, some of these tariff measures were introduced. So companies are watching that in more careful consideration. And that is one of the drivers as well, to see that where they should relocate and how and when they should relocate. Also, there are other factors as well. So digitalization is kind of impacting the business models clearly and disrupting also in many ways. And sustainability considerations, which have become more and more in the mind of the consumer, and also for companies as a area and the boards for really to focus on, as an important aspect of it, is also kind of playing a part, in terms of how the companies are looking at diversification or restructuring as well there. But when you discuss all of these challenges, despite all of that, when you look at Asia's supply chain, they have simply adjusted and continue to thrive. And I'll give you an example. If you look at the consumer goods and retail sector, the companies in this sector are actively looking at Southeast Asia to renew their sourcing models. Opportunities are existing for development in Southeast Asia, and these are mainly dependent on the ability of companies and their suppliers to shift manufacturing for scale production. Key hotspots to look out for have been Mexico, Vietnam, Indonesia, and India. And in my view, the future of the relocation in the region will a lot depend on how long the global trade dynamic plays out. We've seen this playing out for the last 2 years. We have to see that how in future also it plays out. And in this duration also, some of the global companies have managed to negotiate tariff exclusions, for themselves, with their home governments. And in the aspect that the companies which are hopeful of securing such inclusions in future as well, they may be the ones who may delay their shift in production, or be able to find some alternatives for production which is happening in China or a dominant geography there. Also, some companies which are capital constrained, because some sectors have been hit very hard, so they may also be the ones who may delay the decision and shift around it. At the same time, if you look at the opportunity from an Asia perspective or aspect perspective there, at that, I think the competitiveness of manufacturing capacity, including the important factors always, which are going into as a production cost in terms of land, labor, logistics, all of these will continue to play a very key role in determining the potential growth of the region clearly as a global supply chain hub that it aspires to be as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Very interesting. Very interesting. So then let me ask you a follow-up question to the previous one. So productivity has been one of the key drivers that companies are looking at when they're reshoring, and they're seeing that the increased use of automation is helping in some cases to offset higher labor costs. So given that that's one of the many possible realignment options, with increased automation, Neeraj, do you think that reshoring will become a preferred business model for multinational companies in the manufacturing space? And does this impact what some of the emerging economies are trying to do in terms of attracting fresh investment?
No, it's an interesting question and a relevant one as well. Thank you, Marisa, for asking that. If you look at it, step back a bit and look at it, that the MNCs, from the developed world have traditionally offshored many production processes, primarily to take the advantage on the labor cost aspect of it there. And that has also helped in kind of shaping the international production and also the global value chains also as they emerged, from the late 80s and 70s aspect of it there. And large scale adoption of cheaper industrial robots, as we are seeing now more and more the adoption happening on it. This has the potential to reverse this trend as well by reducing the competitive advantage that a naturally a low cost manufacturing hub would provide, in developing countries aspect of it or emerging countries point of view there. Also, there is a increasingly wider adoption of digital technologies like 3D printing. That is also, basically has an impact to say that will that enable reshoring and also vertical integration for some of these companies which had kind of moved their outsourcing for many parts and many full operations as well to developing countries there in that. along with the fact that labor cost in the emerging markets, like China, when it started, in the early to late 90s, and then to the labor cost which is there today, there has been a significant difference that has come in there. Same for some of the other developing countries also, like India, Vietnam, Indonesia, where the labor costs have also been rising. Of course, comparatively it's still low, but there is an impact on the increase in labor costs as well there. At the same time, when you look at some of these positive side of it for reshoring, as one of the factors to look at, because productivity, like you said, is one of the key drivers for offshoring, and now productivity can be offset, with or achieved, by some of these changes in technology usage around it. So at the same time, these require significant investment. And also, in many cases, as we've seen in that, if you have dependency on one particular location, it could lead to challenges as well. So these reshoring initiatives could also lead to somewhat of vulnerability that one gets with the domestic disruption if at any point it happens around it. And also, like like in case of a semiconductor part of it there, a semiconductor fab plant today would cost anything between 5 billion to 20 billion US dollars, for setting that up there. So this is a significant investment which has to be done for a reshoring effort, which has to be done. So in my view, the extent to which operations might be reshored will continue to depend on like a number of factors which are beyond the government incentives, and would also look at saying that what type of industry it is there, the cost of producing it locally compared to overseas, the availability of skilled labor, also the access to raw material. So in some sectors, it may just not be possible also to fully integrate the supply chain, because some of the tasks that are to be done are kind of concentrated in the other economies. In other cases, it's like the natural resource, like for example, the extraction of rare earths, for use in electronics. That's kind of concentrated in a particular geography, and the process to extract that also is kind of currently concentrated. There could be some environmental factors as well, where the sustainability element is playing out in terms of the laws in an aspect of it also, or maybe geographical location as well. So from some of these aspects, these all will have to get considered before a decision gets taken in terms of reshoring, which is from a productivity perspective there. And from an India perspective, if you look at it, then given our geographical proximity, to manufacturing clusters which are there in Asia, and also as Naveen also was mentioning, the ease of doing business, or the ease of operability, that is something which has been improving in India over the years. And the last few years have seen a very significant traction on that. And the Indian government aims to get to in the top 50 in terms of countries, in terms of ease of doing business aspect of it. So one would say that the reshoring is unlikely to impact India in the near medium term. And then we'll have to see that, how much the productivity factor plays out. Like I said, in particular industry, there's some of that could be significant, but not in the medium term there.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, let's delve a little bit more into the India opportunities specifically and some of the sectoral trends that you're seeing. Among the emerging economies, India really seems to have gone out full throttle in the race to become a preferred alternate location. Naveen, do you mind telling us a little bit about what you think in terms of how successful it has been so far, and what, in your view, are some of the dominant factors that the country has been able to leverage to attract some of this investment?
Thanks, Marisa, for the question. So I think historically, as you look at it, the general impression about India has always been, and it's a complex country. It's very difficult to do business. There is lack of predictability. There's lack of certainty. We've seen situations where there have been retroactive changes in tax laws, which investors have been worried about. The foreign investment policy has been to some extent restricted in certain sectors. So I think we've seen now over the last several years, we've seen, especially in the last 4 years, a step change that is happening. One is to change the overall sentiment on India, that India wants to attract investment in the country. And that's evidenced by the fact that the FDI, as Neeraj mentioned, has gone up to $64 billion, which is the highest that we've seen in any year, and in a difficult year. We talked about a pandemic year, right? So I think the government is now working closely. And in India, you have a federal structure and a state structure. I think this is where both the federal and the state governments seem to be working with a common objective to make it easier for companies to operate. So the ease of doing business, where India has moved up some 70 odd places, has made a big difference. And this is visible not just at the central level, but this is visible and this is being measured at the state level as well. So of course, tax does play an important role. If you're supplying goods to India, if you're sourcing from India, if you are operating in India, tax does play an important consideration. So the fact that India has made its tax rate competitive, the fact that it is now more, manufacturing led, manufacturing has become attractive for companies to do, given that, there's a lower tax rate applicable on manufacturing. The fact that the government is trying to, essentially offer incentives, which we've spoken about, and these incentives are being offered across sectors where India wants to be a dominant player in terms of, both in terms of managing the domestic market as well as for export purposes. I think all of that is changing, a fundamental change in how investors look at India today. I think this will have a long-term impact in terms of driving additional investment.
Thank you. Thank you. So Himanshu, let's turn to you. And a few times now in this webinar, we've mentioned that the government of India has this PLI scheme, the Production Linked Incentive Scheme, which is seen as an attempt to help India integrate with global value chains. So first, can you just briefly describe this scheme, and for folks who may not be very familiar with it, and then tell us, what do you see in terms of the success of this scheme in attracting fresh manufacturing related investments?
Thanks, Marisa. And I guess this is the most important topic that from an India government, from a messaging perspective, that how serious is the government to take this initiative and make the reality increasing manufacturing in India, contribution of manufacturing in India's economy, as also integrating India in the global value chain. So let me first outline in a very language as to what is this scheme all about. This scheme, production link incentive scheme, is that the incremental sales over a base year. So if the base year is the year 2020, that the incremental sales that are made over the next 5 years, a particular percentage of that incremental sale will be available as a subsidy, as an incentive. But there are qualification criteria, and there has to be an investment which leads to incremental sale, and that incremental sale leads to the incentive. And the incentive could be anything in the range of 2%, 3% to up to 10%, depending on, as Neeraj earlier was mentioning, that depending on the focus, it could be as high as 10%. And that can be the significant contributor to making in the decision making, tilting the flavor for India. Now, in this PLI scheme that has been thought through, there is a precedence to it, and there is a success story which has led and given the confidence to the government, make it happen and make it widespread for 10 sectors. And the success story has been when in 2014 India launched the mobile handset manufacturing and supported it through a PLI scheme. India was manufacturing around mobile handsets in 2014, and by 2020, in 6 years span, the mobile phone manufacturing in India is 260 millions. And that almost covers 96% of India's mobile phone handset market requirement. Success of that narrative makes the government believe that this success story can be replicated and can be important sectors. But PLI scheme in itself, I would say that if I have to characterize India, if the India narrative of 1991 onwards to 2050, if we take that 25 years of India, if engagement with the global economy, and India started opening up to global economy in 1991. So the last 25 years have been, if I illustratively say that it was India 1.0. So 16 onward is really the India 2.0, which is unfolding, and at the core of it is this PLI scheme. But it has to be understood in the larger context also, like Naveen was describing, that the effective tax rate the corporate tax rate is being reduced. But when you blend it with the other narrative where the tax at the border, which is the custom duty rates, is being increased. So if we look at the effective tax rate, and assuming that for a business the effective tax rate works out to around 40% or 50%, there is an internal churning that is happening within that effective tax rate, where corporate tax is reducing, so that the value addition that gets captured in the economy, that attracts a lower tax rate, but the tax at the border increases, which means that there is a very distinct effort to create a basket of India where addition can attract lower rate of taxation, and that value and the incremental production will also attract greater incentives. So the combination of these measures are making it a very powerful narrative. And the last comment on this is that the multinationals who have engaged with India in India 1.0 will look at this opportunity as the next trigger for next 20 years business call that needs to be taken as to how do they want to engage with this India 2.0. And by the end of these 20 years, India should be, as the expectation is that it should be the third largest economy. And leading on that path would be this initiative. So it's a long answer to your short question, but I guess putting this in context was important.
Oh, thank you. Very interesting. Very interesting. Some very big goals there. So it'd be great to see how the crystal ball plays out as time goes forward. So shifting a little bit, we've talked about the electronics sector, manufacturing, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, where you've described how India has been very determined to move up the global value chain. So Neeraj, do you mind telling us a little bit about, in your view, some of the other emerging sectors where India can be seen as a strong contender to become a reliable supply chain partner, both from a manufacturing as well as a sourcing perspective?
Oh, sure. Well, there are multiple sectors, Marisa. Two sectors that I believe can further bolster India's position in the global value chain my picks would be chemicals and toys. Both the sectors have the potential to make India a global manufacturing hub in the years to come. And if I delve a little bit, more specifically, let's say to start with chemicals, the Indian chemical industry is one of the fastest growing sectors in the world, and is projected to be worth $300 billion by 2025. And in terms of demand as well, the industry has grown by almost 1.3 times the country's average GDP growth in the last 5 years. And that has a strong linkage to the GDP growth as well. Some of the factors in terms of increasing domestic demand from end user industries, increasing export opportunities as well, with the current trade dynamic that we've been discussing during this session, and also the low per capita consumption of chemicals. Currently in India, we consume 1/10 of the world's average consumption of chemical products. So there is a significant production possibilities within India as well to meet the growing domestic demand, which is currently at a lower average also, and also the potential to use also is increasing there. And if I quickly move to the toys as well, the global market for toy sector is estimated around $90 billion. The Indian government, the Indian central government or union government's support, which has been in the form of export subsidies, single window clearance, there have been a number of fiscal incentives, and also technology upgradation. If these are targeted and directed towards the toy sector, it will really help it to grow very, very fast. There. Our new education policy, the Indian government came up with a new education policy recently that focuses on vocational education in schools. That also has a potential that, since it will focus on enhancing the cognitive and also psychomotor skills, this will also encourage the global toy market to look at India as a manufacturing destination, both for domestic supply and also for various kind of exports to happen. And that also should play down, from a perspective of how the realignment of supply chain should happen. So my pick would be chemicals and toy sector. Are the other two sectors that we should look at, apart from we spoke already on the electronics and the pharma sector there.
Great, thank you. It's very encouraging to hear about some of the educational shifts and investment that's being made. So we've gotten some questions from our audience about the tax ecosystem. So let's go that route now. And while analysis of the tax ecosystem and some of the related incentives are crucial when a company is evaluating the tax climate of a location from a supply chain perspective, we see that technology now has an increasingly important role to play. So Naveen, with India moving toward a digitally stable economy, how is the tax landscape adapting to this in order to bring greater transparency and accountability with, of course, speed?
Thanks, Marisa, for that question. So I think this is one area where I would say that the taxpayer is playing catch up to what the government is doing. And India is moving at breakneck speed in terms of integration of various tax systems at the back end and to facilitate exchange of information. So as you know that in India, we have direct taxes, indirect taxes, transfer pricing, whole lot of taxes that one needs to manage. And so far, historically, all these were operating as silos, and there wasn't so much of exchange of information happening either within the various tax departments or outside of the tax department. So this whole tech enablement has facilitated a lot of exchange of information happening seamlessly and on a real-time basis. And this, in a way, is bringing more predictability and is also, in some sense, leading to simplification, because the government wants to ease the compliance burden for taxpayers, wants to ensure that there are no surprises. And effectively, they're also, as recently, they've just launched a new portal, which then becomes a one-stop shop for processing various registrations, doing various sorts of compliances. So it's becoming easier for taxpayers to manage their entire compliance framework. And there, the government is putting a lot of investment behind it. They're even going to the extent saying that we will auto-populate your tax return in India. So you will get a return which is substantially auto-populated by the tax department. You will get your refund very fast, and that's something that the government is really sticking to its. And otherwise, getting a tax refund out of India was a nightmare, but now it comes into your bank account without any follow-ups. There's a single dashboard where you can actually interact with the tax department. The government, India is the only country where the entire tax audit process is going to be completely automated and digital. So you won't even have to visit the tax office. Your entire audit will happen in a faceless manner. This has not been tested in any other part of the world. So India is sort of launching into this. In fact, it started about a year and a half back. Of course, it will have its teething troubles, but this is the level of transparency, predictability that they want to achieve and ensure that there are no baseless and frivolous disputes that get raised and causes agony and concern to the taxpayer. So all in all, I would say that it's a changing environment. Technology is enabling it. It also got, in some sense, accentuated with what happened on the GST front, because GST in India was a landmark reform that happened. And all of that was done through a technology backbone. And now that GST has seen through a few years, we're also seeing other technology interventions where we're moving towards electronic invoicing, etc. So all of this is helping in ensuring ease of operability for the businesses, also ensuring stability, predictability, and transparency.
Very interesting. So Himanshu, I have a question for you about multinational corporations that are operating in India today that are mostly characterized as limited distributors. Do you think that they would consider adding more assets or functions and move toward more entrepreneurial characterization?
Marisa, the answer is in affirmative, but the interesting part of it is why we take a call that it will head that way. The companies will add more value in India, more functions, more assets, and more risks. As earlier saying that India 1.0 was high corporate tax rate and low custom duty rates. So custom duty rates used to be 7.5%. That has been the character of India from 1990 to almost 2018. and the corporate tax rate was high to around 33%. So low tax rate at the border, high tax rate in India encouraged the companies to finish the goods outside and get the finished goods in India, and leave only a smaller margin of profit in India to be offered to corporate tax. That equation is changing. The corporate tax rate is moving down from 35% to 22%, and for value addition of manufacturing up to 15%, while the tax at the border in the customs duty is moving up. And I'll take the illustration of what when Neeraj mentioned about toy industry, and that is a apt illustration to say that the custom duty rate on toys, which used to be 10%, has been moved to 50%. So a six-fold increase in effective tax rate for toys, which means that getting a finished toy into India becomes a challenge. And given this, there is a logical preference for any business to bring inputs and intermediate goods into India, add value in India, and offer that value addition and margin to taxes. So there will be a very logical movement in response to this a rehash of the tax rates, which will result in the companies preferring to move from a limited risk distributor model to a normal risk distributor, or a normal distributor, or more towards entrepreneurial and manufacturing companies.
Interesting. So let's shift a little bit and look at market entry considerations and challenges. So as you've mentioned, India has made considerable improvement in the ranking from the World Bank's overall ease of doing business, but the country is still often tagged as complex and challenging in terms of its business environment. So Naveen, can you just sort of recap for us, what are the key considerations for a foreign business that's really planning to make entry into India?
I think we've spoken about this, Marisa. Just to sort of recap briefly, I would say that simplification in setting up your business in India, and what we've just spoken about of how you can start a company very fast. You can do a lot of it electronically. You don't have to interact with multiple departments. So all of that obviously helps in ensuring that you're up and running quickly. The kind of approvals that you need to obtain, because you're dealing with central and state governments. So you need to obtain different permissions, especially if you're in the manufacturing sector, the number of approvals increase. So a lot of that has been streamlined through a single one-stop shop kind of interface. And a lot of this documentation, obviously, there's also lesser focus on the documentation required to obtain those approvals. The systems are far more integrated now. So it's easier if you're not really having a business in India, but you're just simply exporting goods just doing trading with India. It's a lot easier to do that because there is integration of several government agencies again into an online systems. And if you're trading across borders, then your ability to do post clearance or clearance of goods and the post clearance audits has been streamlined. There's been an upgradation of the port infrastructure. A lot of the documents don't have to be submitted physically; it can be submitted electronically. So all of this has, in essence, really removed some of the challenges that businesses were historically facing. And the intent and the approach really of the government is to address anything that comes up, which can, they look at a number of parameters, and then wherever there are challenges, they're trying to address that in some form or manner.
Okay. Thank you. So Neeraj, let's turn back to you. So while this realignment trend has really changed the dynamic in several sectors, it's also brought about some important challenges and brought them to the surface. Can you elaborate on an area where you think we need to have some considerable thinking or action taken?
Interesting question. And if I say that an area that we could consider is TMT, or the telecom media technologies sector. Here players have an opportunity to create a vertically integrated marketplace, which is kind of bringing the global manufacturing base closer to the end customers. And with the convergence of various TMT subsectors, the security threat is expanding from cyber risk to digital risk. And with the rapid adoption of digital technologies, it becomes even more critical as more and more data and applications are coming to the forefront. With the pandemic, I mean, the digitization projects, for companies have been growing multiple fold there. And then that also brings with it the cybersecurity digital risk issue also, there. And as we see, the boundaries across ecosystems are getting blurred, so which will kind of lead to rapid exchange of data and information. And in order to overcome this, majority of the organizations are reaching out to establish robust cybersecurity management and also data protection policies to create a broader level of trust and also transparency. And as we see that cybersecurity was always amongst the top business risks, look at multiple surveys that have happened in the past. Cybersecurity continues to be the a top business risk there. Sustainability also, has been flagged off in the recent years as a very, very key area. But cybersecurity has always been in the top 5, and it has also continuing as well with the experience of the pandemic. Like I just said, that with the digitalization happening more and more, the risk is only expanding. So we also see that in our experience that that boards and audit committees are spending a lot more time now on the understanding this risk. But the pace of this change, is only adding to more and more complexity, and newer technologies are also getting introduced, there at that, which are disrupting the business model, operation model as well. And as you kind of go into more open source and also more collaboration with the various partners, this risk is only increasing there. And hence this is one area, wherein the digital trust that will be vital to maximizing the opportunity that has been presented to all of us, with the rapid adoption that is happening on digital and cloud technologies. So my thoughts would say that digital trust to kind of enable and mitigate this digital risk, that would be one of the significant areas to think and deliberate and also act upon.
Excellent point. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you so much. I want to thank Neeraj, Naveen, and Himanshu. And thank everyone who joined us today and has attended our webinar. We are now going to be wrapping up. And I would like to just encourage everyone who is listening to please take our post-webinar satisfaction survey. And thank you, KPMG in India, for sharing your thought leadership with us on what the opportunity looks like in India for supply chain realignment. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.